On a cool morning in Geneva, a UN official held up a glossy plan and said, "The world is on fire." But Sudan is what that sentence looks like when it becomes literal. A country the size of a continent, a war older than 2.5 years, and a civilian collapse so vast it has displaced more than 12 million people. In Khartoum, power shifted street by street, then drones crossed the country and rewrote the battlefield in seconds. In el-Fasher, a siege tightened into hunger. People ate animal feed to stay alive. And when the city fell, the horror didn't end. It multiplied. Here is the uncomfortable truth. This is not just Sudan falling apart. It is a modern war built to keep going, fed by outside backers, money, and supply chains. If you want clear, unsimplified analysis like this, subscribe now. It helps this channel keep telling the stories the world looks away from. Now let's name the real problem. Because Sudan is not only a tragedy, it is a system. The problem is not that Sudan collapsed overnight. The problem is that the collapse was engineered to last. This war is often described as chaos. But on the ground, it is structured. 2 armed blocks, dozens of militias, civilians trapped in between. The Sudanese armed forces hold the east. The rapid support forces dominate much of the west. Between them lies a country carved into supply routes, siege zones, and drone corridors. Food is not scarce by accident. Aid does not fail by chance. Access is blocked by design. Gold moves while people starve. Oil facilities change hands while hospitals are bombed. Foreign weapons arrive faster than humanitarian convoys. And while diplomats talk about ceasefires, the war adapts. It stretches across regions. It stretches across borders. It stretches across time using medieval starvation tactics and modern drone warfare at once. To understand where this is going, we have to understand where it came from. Because Sudan's disaster did not begin with this war. It began long before the first shot was fired. This war did not start as a blank page. It started as a continuation. For decades, Sudan has been governed through force, not consent. Power flowed through the gun. Resources flowed upward. And entire regions were managed through neglect or repression. Darfur learned this first. So did the Nuba Mountains. So did Blue Nile. Militias were not accidents. They were tools. Outsourced violence, rewarded with access to land, gold, and impunity. Over time, the state hollowed itself out. Institutions weakened. Loyalty replaced law. And when the old regime fell, the system did not disappear. It fractured. 2 armed centers emerged from the same machinery. Both claimed legitimacy. Both relied on militias. Both treated civilians as leverage. When war finally broke out, it followed familiar cycles. Cities became prizes. Sieges became strategy. Starvation became a weapon. But something had changed. This time, the war plugged directly into global markets. Gold, oil, weapons, drones. And that shift transformed a national collapse into something far more dangerous. Because once a war becomes profitable, ending it becomes optional. And that brings us to the first true breaking point. In the wake of the first great push, the war in Sudan began to spread like wildfire. Khartoum fell into a false optimism. The Sudanese armed forces pushed back the RSF, reclaiming ground, but victory was short-lived. Within weeks, drones from the far reaches of Sudan turned the tide, striking military bases, including the de facto headquarters in Port Sudan. The RSF, now armed with drones that reached every corner of the country, shifted tactics. They turned their focus back to Darfur, where the siege of el-Fasher had already begun. A city under siege is a city dying. By the summer of 2024, civilians in el-Fasher resorted to eating animal feed to survive. The siege tightened as aid was blocked, but the Sudanese armed forces were not the only ones trapped. The RSF siege wasn't just about territorial conquest. It was about control, control over food, control over the people, control over the narrative. And when the siege was broken, the RSF took the city with it. Reports from fleeing civilians painted a chilling image. Massacres, torture, people hunted down as they tried to escape. The global response to this escalating violence? Largely indifferent, but then something changed. Video footage of atrocities began to spread. Sudan's war found its audience. And for a brief moment, the international community blinked. What followed was a sudden shift in the war's narrative, a shift that could not be ignored. But this shift wasn't a change in tactics. It was a change in the weapons used. The world watched as drones became the dominant force in Sudan's battlefield. Both sides began using long-range strategic drones, but the stakes had escalated. For the Sudanese military, Turkish-made drones soared across the sky. For the RSF, drones manufactured in China were deployed to strike deep into enemy territory. These drones didn't just reshape the battlefield, they redefined the war itself. As the RSF solidified its hold over Darfur, the war spilled into Kordofan, where control was split between the RSF and the Sudanese military. Cities fell, one by one, Baba Nusa, Kadugli. And then came the seizure of Sudan's largest oil facility at Heglig, just north of South Sudan. In the hands of the RSF, this was more than military control. It was financial power. Oil, gold, and the global supply chains that connected them had turned this conflict into something more than just a civil war. It had become a war economy. But in Kordofan, another crisis was unfolding. The lives of thousands of civilians were being affected by these shifting alliances, by the violent fractures running through the region. At the same time, foreign backers began taking sides, not just with words, but with actions. The UAE, Turkey, Egypt, and Sudan's neighbors each played their part in fueling the conflict, not just with weapons, but with strategic alliances. But all this came at a cost. The cost of a humanitarian disaster that seemed to have no end in sight. Now, as Sudan spirals toward full-scale regional destabilization, we are left with a chilling question. Can this conflict be stopped before it spreads beyond Sudan's borders? Or will the forces at play push the region and the world into a much larger crisis? The humanitarian situation in Sudan has gone from dire to catastrophic. The international response, however, seems to be one of confusion and failure. As famine spreads and millions of civilians are trapped by warring factions, foreign aid becomes increasingly difficult to deliver. The World Food Programme, which once provided vital lifelines to millions, has been forced to announce massive cuts in food rations, now down to 70% of previous amounts. Yet, even as humanitarian efforts shrink, the war economy thrives. The RSF is not simply a military force. It is an economic actor in its own right, controlling vast gold resources and now dominating the oil fields of Sudan. Meanwhile, foreign backers like the UAE and Egypt continue to pour weapons into Sudan, playing a game of geopolitics, while civilians starve and cities burn. What does this all mean for the people of Sudan? The effects are felt not only by the displaced civilians inside the country, but by neighboring nations as well. The war is spilling over borders, with extremist groups eyeing Sudan as a fertile ground for recruitment and exploitation. And through all this chaos, the global community remains passive. Sanctions and diplomatic pressure have done little to stop the flow of weapons or the escalation of violence. In fact, they may be doing more harm than good, as they prevent the delivery of aid to the very people who need it most. This is not just a war. It is a global failure. A failure to stop the violence, a failure to provide for the victims, a failure to end the suffering. In Sudan, the consequences of this war are not confined to the battlefield. They reach into the lives of every citizen. The human toll is immeasurable. For the civilians trapped in cities like el-Fasher, the war is a constant terror, a slow, suffocating grip. The siege on el-Fasher, for example, was not just a military strategy. It was a direct assault on the most vulnerable: the children, the elderly, the sick, the people who had no power to escape, no way to protect themselves from the horrors outside. And yet, despite all of this, there are stories of remarkable courage. The Sudanese people, despite the horror they endure, continue to help one another. They risk their lives to feed the starving. They fight to keep medical facilities open even when their own lives are in jeopardy. But these acts of bravery are not enough. Humanitarian aid is still being blocked. International assistance is still inadequate. And the world's indifference only deepens the pain. The emotional toll is felt most acutely by those who have lost everything. Families torn apart, homes reduced to rubble, cities leveled, their history erased. For these civilians, the war is not just a political event, it is personal. It is a crisis that reshapes their very identity, their sense of security, their hopes for the future. And in this darkness, what is the world's response? More sanctions, more condemnation, but no concrete action to stop the suffering. No real plan to bring this war to an end. The humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan has already begun to affect the entire region, and the impact is only growing. Sudan's neighbors are watching the conflict with alarm, knowing that instability in one of the largest countries in Africa can destabilize an entire region. The Horn of Africa is already a volatile region, and the collapse of Sudan has sent shockwaves through its neighbors. Ethiopia, Eritrea, Chad, and South Sudan are all grappling with their own challenges, but the instability in Sudan threatens to spill over into these nations as well. Egypt, in particular, has a vested interest in what happens in Sudan. The two countries share not only a border but also a critical resource, the Nile River. If Sudan falls into further chaos, the control of the Nile could be affected, threatening Egypt's water security. Already, Egypt has made it clear that Khartoum is a red line. If the RSF makes further gains toward the capital, Egypt may have no choice but to intervene. Meanwhile, Eritrea is quietly maneuvering behind the scenes, supporting factions within Sudan, hoping to gain influence in the region. This is not just a matter of territorial control. It's about securing strategic resources like oil, gold, and access to key waterways. The broader geopolitical struggle is becoming clearer. The Gulf states, particularly the UAE, have backed the RSF, while Egypt and Saudi Arabia support the Sudanese military. This is not just about Sudan anymore, it's about regional dominance, access to resources, and influence over the Red Sea and Nile waterways. As the region fractures, the impact on global security becomes more pronounced. The proliferation of weapons, the rise of extremist groups, and the growth of illicit trade across borders threaten to pull neighboring countries into a much larger conflict. And as these foreign powers fight for influence in Sudan, the people, those who are the true victims of this war, are left to bear the brunt of the destruction. The future of Sudan is uncertain, and the potential scenarios are grim. In a best-case scenario, peace could be restored through a negotiated settlement, with all parties coming to the table and agreeing to a ceasefire. The international community, finally galvanized, could provide the support necessary for a transition to a stable and inclusive government, one that takes into account the needs of Sudan's diverse regions and people. A new government could emerge, one that addresses the root causes of the conflict, systemic inequalities, ethnic violence, and the economic exploitation that has fueled the war. If this happens, Sudan could begin the long and painful process of healing. Aid could flow, civilians could return to their homes, and the region could start to rebuild. But this is a scenario that seems increasingly unlikely. The more probable outcome is a prolonged, drawn-out conflict, with Sudan remaining divided between competing military factions and foreign powers. The RSF and the Sudanese armed forces, both deeply entrenched, could continue fighting for control of the country, while the international community remains mired in ineffective diplomacy. In this scenario, Sudan could become a failed state, one with fragmented territories, no functioning government, and no ability to provide for its people. Civilian suffering would continue to escalate, with famine, disease, and violence becoming the new normal. The worst-case scenario, however, is one in which the conflict spills over into neighboring countries, sparking a regional war that destabilizes the entire Horn of Africa. Extremist groups could seize the opportunity to strengthen their presence, and neighboring nations like Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Chad could be pulled into the conflict, further complicating efforts to restore peace. The future of Sudan, in all its potential outcomes, is tied to the forces at play: foreign intervention, regional dynamics, and the aspirations of Sudanese civilians who, despite everything, still dream of peace. But as the world watches from the sidelines, one thing is certain: the longer this war drags on, the less likely peace will seem. As the conflict in Sudan drags on, the hope for a resolution grows dimmer. This is a war that was never supposed to last this long, but it has. The international community has failed to bring about meaningful change. Sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and calls for peace have all fallen short. Meanwhile, the suffering on the ground continues to deepen. At this point, the only thing that can stop the war is a dramatic shift in both the international response and the internal dynamics of Sudan. The world must recognize that Sudan's crisis is not just a local problem, it is a global one. The instability in Sudan affects not only the people who live there, but also the entire region, and beyond that, global security itself. The future of Sudan rests in the hands of those who can bring an end to this war. But will they? Or will they let the conflict continue until the very fabric of Sudan is destroyed? If there's a lesson to be learned from this tragedy, it's that the world cannot afford to ignore crises like this. We cannot stand by while millions of people suffer and entire nations are pushed to the brink of collapse. The time to act is now. Sudan is a crossroads, not just for the country, but for all of us. What happens next will shape the future of a region and the world for years to come. The world must not turn its back on Sudan. Share this story. Raise awareness. Demand action. Because until the war ends, Sudan's struggle will continue to be the world's struggle.